I mean, look, Bill, I'm not a bigot. You know the kind of books I've written about the civil rights movement in this country. But when I get on a plane, I got to tell you, if I see people who are in Muslim garb, and I think, you know, they're identifying themselves first and foremost as Muslims, I get worried. I get nervous.
This is not a reflection on his comments. This is not a debate. You know, Juan feels the way he feels. That is not for me to pass judgment on. That is really his feelings that he expressed on Fox News are really between him and his, you know, psychiatrist or his publicist, or take your pick. But it is not compatible with a news analyst with the role of a news analyst on NPR's air.
NPR terminating its contract with Juan Williams as a news analyst after something he said on Bill O'Reilly's show Monday night. Juan says he got a call from Ellen Weiss, NPR's senior vice president for news, Wednesday evening.
She said, you know, this has been decided up the chain. I said, you mean I don't even get the chance to come in and we do this eyeball to eyeball, person to person, have a conversation? I've been there for more than 10 years. We don't have that chance to have a conversation about this. And she said, there's nothing you can say that will change my mind. This has been decided above me, and we're terminating your contract.
President and CEO of this company, Roger Ailes, has announced that he is extending and expanding Juan Williams' contract with Fox News Channel as of today. What about all of this? Let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, senior writer for the Weekly Standard, Nia Malika Henderson of the Washington Post, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Charles.
Well, I want to start by having people look at this quote from Jesse Jackson about 18 years ago, in which he says, I hope we can put it up on the screen, that when he walks down the street, hears footsteps, and he starts thinking about robbery, he looks around, and when he sees someone who is white, he feels relieved. Jesse Jackson is saying this. In other words, if the people he looked at were black, he would feel anxiety or fear. Now, there's nobody in his right mind who's going to say that Jesse Jackson is a racist, anti-black racist. He's not. So what's happening here? There are two elements in what he does here. He talks about a feeling, which is related to a statistical fact. The feeling is the anxiety he feels. And the fact he's talking about, this is implicit, of course, is the empirical fact that there's a higher rate of crime among young African Americans than among young blacks. Now, he regrets this. He regrets this. And he says the feeling of relief is a result of this, obviously, statistical disparity. Now, think of what Juan has said. It's exactly the same kind of statement. He talks about a feeling he has when he sees a person in Muslim garb. And then he spoke explicitly about how it's related to an empirical reality. The empirical reality is one we all know, that overwhelmingly the acts of terrorism in the world, the attacks on airplanes, buildings, on mosques around the world the last 20 years have been overwhelmingly carried out not by the IRA or the Tamil Tigers or the German Red Army, but by radical Islamists. So he makes a statement that's perfectly parallel with what Jackson said. Now, you explain to me why nobody would attribute hostility, bigotry, or racism in the Jackson statement, and yet NPR attributes to the Juan Williams statement, and not only attributes it, but does it with such certainty that it dismisses him without even a hearing. I'd like to hear one executive in NPR defend that. If not, this is not just a case of political correctness, it's a case of intellectual cowardice.
Nia, NPR's executives, the president of NPR, Vivian Schiller, said today that there have been multiple incidents where they've talked to Juan about speaking out and expressing his opinions, and they've been uncomfortable with it. What about all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, in a way, Juan Williams was in a pretty unhappy marriage with NPR for the last couple of years, and this is the final straw for them. And, you know, I think some journalists over the last couple of weeks and months have run into similar situations. CNN, you know, fired Rick Sanchez for some comments he made about Jon Stewart. But I do think, I mean, as a journalist, I think there is this kind of increasing blurring of the lines between commentary and analysis and opinion and what is straight news and objective, you know, objective reporting. And in some ways, I think Juan Williams got tripped up with that. But also, I mean, I think one of the underlying things is just that he was in a very precarious position from the point of view of his bosses.
He's been a contributor here for a long time. Speaking of other opinions, perhaps, Here's a couple quotes. Nina Totenberg, NPR correspondent, said this about Jesse Helms, former Republican senator. I think he ought to be worried about what's going on in the good Lord's mind, because if there's retributive justice, he'll get AIDS from a transfusion, or one of his grandchildren will. There's also an incident about a recent story about learning the language of teabag. Steve? Well, those people still have jobs.
You don't need to look that far back to see what Nina Totenberg has said. I looked at what she said over the last 4 weeks, and let's make a key distinction here. Nina Totenberg is an NPR correspondent, not an analyst, which suggests some blending of fact and opinion, but a correspondent. She's a reporter, and she's on a show in Washington that Charles is on as well, called Inside Washington. And over the last 4 weeks, she has said the following things: that Michelle Obama makes voters feel, quote, warm and fuzzy, that Bill Clinton was the most gifted politician she has ever seen, that the Supreme Court ruling, which she covers in Citizens United, was outrageous, scandalous, and could lead to another Watergate. And then the one that I find most outrageous of all, in a discussion about the tax cuts, extending the tax cuts, there was a discussion about the 31 Democrats who had written to Nancy Pelosi and said, we want to extend these tax cuts for everyone. Nina Totenberg said, lamented the diversity in the Democratic Party, said when you have a huge majority, you have huge diversity. And that is a part of the problem that Democrats have. But would I like it to be otherwise? Of course. So here she's taking not only, an ideological position or a philosophical position, but an expressly partisan position. Now, the position of Vivian Schiller, the CEO of NPR, last night it was that Juan was let go because he had made these comments on Bill O'Reilly's show. Today, after that had been widely criticized, she changed the rationale altogether. She said, no, it's really not those comments. It's just the fact that he's expressed an opinion. Well, if that's the case, how does Nina Totenberg, who is not an analyst, but a reporter, how does she possibly keep her job? And the final point, how does Vivian Schiller, after questioning with a smirk, like we saw on that video, Juan Williams' sanity for saying the things he said, how does she possibly keep her job? I hope it's not just Republicans that call for her dismissal, but that they're joined by numerous Democrats. You can't do that kind of a thing in public. It's deeply irresponsible.
She said talk to a psychiatrist or a publicist. John Boehner, the minority leader, Charles, came out with a statement saying this: Washington is borrowing 37 cents of every dollar it spends from our kids and grandkids. Given that, I think it's reasonable to ask why Congress is spending taxpayers' money to support a left-wing radio network. And in the wake of Juan Williams' firing, it's clearer than ever that's what NPR is. There are calls now to investigate this and to look at funding of NPR.
Well, even in the absence of this travesty, you'd have to ask, why in a world where you have infinite media outlets of every expression, every kind, internet broadcasting, are we subsidizing anybody here? Because obviously it's the opportunity is open to almost anyone. And secondly, I think this really is a travesty, which raises a question of why we ought to be supporting indirectly a left-wing organization. I've known Juan for 20 years. It isn't only that he doesn't have a bigoted opponent in his body. It's that he has distinguished himself in his career, writing and speaking, in fighting against prejudice everywhere he's found it, in every community. And to fire him over this and to make this a part of his record, I think, really is a scandal.
10 seconds.
Well, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is sort of that oversees this funding for public broadcasting, just requested $495 million for the fiscal year of 2014. In a world where we're running a $13 trillion debt, and when you've got 600 satellite channels, you can watch poodle grooming on 5 of them at any given time. There's absolutely no excuse for taking taxpayer funds for taxpayer-funded television.
You're like Juan. That's a long 10 seconds. We're happy he's going to be here for a long time. You can read Juan's side of the story by clicking the link in the show notes section of our homepage. Log on to foxnews.com/special report. Next up, we'll look at some of the big governor's races and why they're so important.